Hello, everyone. I'm Eszter Vajda, and welcome to Politics is Sexy. I'm joined by Tom Farmer, former executive producer with CNN and formerly with Face the Facts USA, and Ed Rombach is formerly with Reuters, now a currency advisor. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening, Eszter.
Again.
Our other panelist, Rich Rubino, is going to try and work out some of his kinks, but lots going on again this week. Number of studies coming out about income inequality in the United States. The wealthy are getting wealthier and the rich getting richer. We'll take a look. Also, a budget deal is reached in the Senate and sent to the president, much different vote than in the House just a few days earlier, but we begin with the NSA and the latest rulings. U.S. District Court judge rules that some of the NSA's practices have been unconstitutional. He used words like Orwellian. And then a presidential panel comes up with recommendations, both daunting and scary for what the NSA has been doing. Tom, what does this all mean? Of course, none of this is a surprise to us here at Politics is Sexy.
Well, first let me just say that I'm sure the audience will stay tuned for an examination of Rich Rubino's kinks, as you put it. That sounds great. To the NSA question, last week we were talking about who the person of the year ought to be. I said Edward Snowden, you guys said the Pope, and last year you said the Pope won. Well, what has the Pope given us? A couple of great photo ops. Edward Snowden has given us a re-examination of our entire security system, the American surveillance state. And there's no greater dramatic illustration of that than the NSA ruling that came down yesterday. Well, actually, two this week. One from the DC judge who said the whole surveillance program is probably unconstitutional. Two, the Obama panel, which ruled that the program deserves wholesale change. Now, what is Obama going to do with these recommendations, which are sweeping and dramatic? Probably nothing. Remember what he did with the Erskine Bowles recommendations about balancing the budget? Nothing. And the president is clearly on the record with supporting the program as it was before all this blew up. But we have a giant debate underway right now about the extent to which modern surveillance techniques ought to be allowed and the price that we're paying for alleged security. And this is seismic. Make no mistake. The Obama administration is turning a corner here and going, in my view, over a precipice with a policy that is doomed to cynical re-examination for the next couple of years.
Okay, then why form this panel in the first place?
Why form
Ed?
any panel in the first place? We have these commissions all the time. It indicates that something might be going on, but nothing really is. We have commissions that issue recommendations that don't get adopted, thick on the ground. There's no evidence that this one is going to get picked up either. In fact, the White House has already said they reject certain recommendations.
Yeah.
Ed?
It's been another bad day at the office for NSA officials, and they really did have a 1-2 punch over the past week. You know, as you itemized already with the Washington District Court ruling and the hand-picked presidential advisory panel, which is basically advising that NSA mass surveillance be scaled back. So I like to think of it as the NSA equivalent of tapering, you know, what the Fed is doing, scaling back their operations. And of course, as Tom was alluding to, none of the recommendations are legally binding. And President Obama is already on record rejecting a recommendation by the panel to separate the NSA from the military cyber command.
Right.
So there's 46 recommendations all told, and many of them are very good, you know, and it's in many ways this strikes a blow for liberty in my estimation. And I want to actually retract my endorsement of Pope Francis for man and endorse Tom's recommendation for Edward Snowden. In fact, I would endorse Edward Snowden for man of the decade because
it is never too late for redemption.
Oh, please.
Rich Rubino, politically, obviously this doesn't look too good again for the president. What recommendations of any of those, of course he's already said that he won't implement some of them, which recommendations would you recommend that he does implement? Okay, Rich Rubino is having audio problems. Ed and Tom, Which recommendations would you recommend out of all of those, if you had a few of the 45 or 47 that were named?
Well, I would vote for one he's already rejected. The commission recommended there should be separate leaders for NSA and Cyber Command. That having one man in holding both offices concentrates too much power. The Obama administration has already said they're not going to pick that one up, but I can't imagine why not. The first step towards instilling some level of public trust in this program again is to create some transparency, and you do that by separating power and making people more accountable, and that's the road that the administration doesn't want to travel. So I'm disappointed already.
Ed, which recommendations would you put into place?
At the top of the list, I think, was a recommendation that the NSA would have to terminate the metadata collection and storage of Americans' phone records and emails and other electronic correspondence, because it poses a threat to privacy rights. It's directly a Fourth Amendment issue, and we've been talking about this for many months, right from the get-go. Instead, the NSA would have to obtain a court order to search for specific phone records, and they would have to have some kind of expectation that the search would be related to terrorist activities or something similar to that. So I mean, that's kind of a broad sweeping brush, but there's 46 recommendations in total. I'd like to take them all, frankly, because this thing is so Orwellian where it's gone, and I feel like this is pretty good. It's not the empire striking back, it's the grassroots striking back in a way. And again, we have Edward Snowden to thank for this. So thank you, Mr. Snowden.
Are you guys surprised? I mean, we've been talking about this for a few months now, and we've known the extent slowly as Edward Snowden reveals some of his findings here and there, dropping papers and information here and there. Are you surprised at the extent and the depth that this NSA spying, if you want to use that word, has gone?
No. Ever since the Patriot Act, ever since the hot and heavy period after 9/11, we have handed a blank check to the black ops world to do whatever they see fit. And in the process, we've lost oversight and control of the whole story. So I would not be surprised if I could, pull up Esther's grocery receipts on some website someplace. Nothing surprises me anymore about this. But I'll tell you what does surprise me a little bit. Let me give you one little small story. Last Sunday night on 60 Minutes, John Miller filed a fawning, uncritical gee whiz report behind closed doors at NSA, and we were all supposed to be real impressed at the excitement and the kind of Star Trek briefing rooms and situation rooms they have in there. The reaction across the board politically on Monday morning was scathing, not just from the press, but from the mainstream, from Politico. What has gone wrong with 60 Minutes? How can they allow this kind of a whitewash? That gives you a sense of how the worm is turned in some quarters with some opinion makers. I think it's a good sign.
Interesting. And go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, the most damning, I think, recommendation to come from the President's Advisory Panel is that there is no evidence that all of this NSA spying and metadata gathering does anything to stop terrorist attacks. It just, notwithstanding all claims to the contrary. And, this is there's going to be several more chapters written here because, the NSA director, James Clapper, lied to Congress when he was asked about whether the NSA is spying on Americans or gathering data. He lied. And that is a punishable offense.
First it was a few dozen, then it turned out to be just one. But then the question becomes, so then what do? How do we ensure our safety post 9/11 and balance that with our personal privacy? And what countries are doing it right?
The first step is to acknowledge that you can achieve reasonable security without total surrender of privacy. We've been so willing to surrender everything and go right down this road to the max without equating any sort of oversight or criticism with a lack of patriotism, that we need to reset that conversation. Of course you can have security without keeping everyone stark naked in the public square, the way the NSA seems to want. Security, that's ridiculous. You can't be assured of total safety when you step on a plane, when you drive down the street, when you walk into a bar. I mean, there's a level of risk in everything. We got to have a more mature conversation about this and accept reasonable risk as the price of living in a free society. Otherwise, the status quo is both ridiculous, inadequate, and needlessly invasive.
Esther, I would say this. I mean, if you consider the declaration of war by Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden on the United States back in 1998, there were three basic conditions that he cited that led to this declaration of war. One was that U.S. troops were occupying a part of Saudi Arabia. This was the post-Kuwait war function. Right? They were on standby in case they had to do that again. So they consider that holy ground, and they didn't want us in Saudi Arabia. The other thing was that our siding with Israel against the Palestinians, which I don't think Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda actually really cared about, but he used that for propaganda purposes. And the other one was citing the fact that between the time of the end of the Kuwait War and the next decade that followed, we were routinely bombing Iraq because in the no-fly zone, whenever they would light up their radar on one of our planes, we would bomb them. And this went on for a long time. And at the same time, we had sanctions, economic sanctions on Iraq that the UN study found that led to the deaths of about 100,000 old people mostly and children. All right, so that was our policy that got us into the crosshairs of Al Qaeda. So maybe we should be thinking more about not having that kind of foreign policy.
Okay, let's move on. We could spend the whole time on this. I want to go into a subject we've sort of been hitting every week, and that is income inequality. President Obama has been talking about it. The Pope Francis has been talking about it. Recent studies show that income inequality in the United States is increasing, rich getting richer, poor getting poorer. Let's just start with the whole premise of it. And do you guys agree that this is happening? Because there are those who say there's a faulty way of measuring this, and that is an inaccurate statement. Tom, what do you think?
Oh, of course it's happening, you bet, and it's been going on for decades. It is not the worst it's ever been, as has been suggested by some. Go back 100, 120 years ago to the railroad barons and the Gilded Age, and the income inequality in this country is horrific. Today it is not that bad, but it is clearly getting worse because the purchasing power of the average middle-class dollar is getting lower. Wages are stagnant. It takes two wage earners to achieve the same household standard what it took one to achieve a generation ago, and it takes money to make money. So the more you've got to invest, the more you're making, and it's not just about sky-high salaries in the executive suite. It's about the ability to invest and earn a return when Wall Street takes off. So a small minority is making most of the money. The real question, Esther, is what are you going to do about it? And most of the suggestions I've heard are punitive towards the people who are making money. How do you tell people to quit making money? How do you legislate against success? You can't. You've got to empower more people, not hobble a few people at the top. And that's where we get to a discussion of education power and the ways to increase earning power at ground level, rather than trying to shake down the rich minority and get them to pay more taxes, which has its adherents, but that kind of economic, those kinds of punitive measures are disastrous. Just look at 1970s Britain if you want to see the downside of that. So yes to income inequality. Wait a minute to most of the punitive measures being discussed to redress it.
So how does this happen, Ed? The stock market is going through the roof. The Fed chair says that the economy is getting better. He's going to taper the $85 billion bond purchases per month. And, Wall Street sings and dances with joy. And again, the rich are getting richer as we get unemployment numbers that are greater. How does this happen?
Well, there's two issues here. One is the taper, and I'll get to that in a bit. But as far as the divide between the 1% and the 99%, the wealth gap, keep this in mind. The Federal Reserve is celebrating its 100th anniversary this month. And it's important to note that the U.S. dollar during this 100-year span has lost 97% of its purchasing power. So according to the Fed's own guidance, which they cite frequently, their target for inflation is 2% per year. Well, if you do the math, you'll find out that 2% inflation over the course of a decade reduces the purchasing power of the dollar by 17%, which is a very bad deal for anyone trying to save for college tuition or retirement planning or just ordinary day-to-day expenses. All right, so in this context, inflation works like a stealth tax that siphons away wealth from the middle class and contributes to economic stagnation by misallocating resources. Moreover, the growing wealth gap between the 1% and the 99% has been accelerating over the past 5 years. And I attribute that to Fed quantitative easing and their low interest rate policy and bailouts. Bailouts of Wall Street, which stuck the bill.
So you think all those things are leading to income inequality, the buying power of the dollar?
Absolutely. Stealth tax, it's like having the Federal Reserve having a Hoover vacuum cleaner in your pocket for sucking out, money on a regular basis.
Okay, well then let's.
Well, we're not in a time of high inflation. We're in. I mean, I remember 30 years ago when people's money market accounts earned 17 or 20%. We're in a time of low inflation. Historically, unnaturally low inflation for certainly since the downturn. So it's not inflation pressure in the near term, is it, Ed? It's more like the ability to invest and get a rate of return. When you have assets, you get more assets.
I'm talking about, Tom, over a long-term time horizon, and 2% a year is not big inflation. In fact, right now the inflation is less than that. The Fed's Consumer Purchasing Pricing Index is showing inflation at that's the Fed's preferred measure at 1.1%, and that's excluding food and energy. With everything thrown in, it's the gain is 0.7%. So that's it is low, but their target, just their stated target, is 2%, and it works out to a 17% decline in the purchasing power of your dollar over the course of a decade.
Some of the
it's systematic.
Some of the things that I've been hearing and reading about having to do with income inequality, not only is it ethically immoral, which is a separate debate, but it's also bad for the economy, bad for violence, bad for your health, bad for all these other aspects that we sort of don't think of. What are your thoughts on that, the sort of uncovered or untalked about side effects of income inequality, Tom?
Well, I'm sure they're probably all true. I'm not going to argue with that. It's stressful to live on a small income. It's hard to be in debt. It is difficult to go for long periods of unemployment. It's hard when you have retirement advisors telling you have to have $2 million in the bank to retire properly, and you've got 25,000 with 10 years to go. Those are all terrible circumstances. What are we? It goes back to the question I asked at the top of this segment. What are we going to do about it? How do you redress this? Well, you can't legislate your way out of this. I mean, yes, there is unhappiness and stress associated with not making enough money. The other side of the coin is how do you figure out how to make more money, and what do you spend that money on when you get it? Too many people, when they make a little more money, instead of buying a Ford, lease themselves a Lexus and drive themselves deeper into the hole. Why aren't you investing? Why aren't you saving for your kids' education? It's not as if personal behavior doesn't play a role in this as well.
Mm.
Okay.
Yes,
anything?
Rich Rubino. Rich Rubino,
Anything?
you're back.
Yes,
you're
me.
back. Okay.
There it is.
You can hear me?
We can hear you.
All right, share your kinks.
Excellent.
Okay, so Rich Rubino, pipe in there.
Excellent. So what are you guys talking about?
we're talking about the weather and how public policy polling has come out with the latest polling on what Democrats think about Christmas and, you know, all that stuff. No, Rich Rubino, politically, you know, the president has been talking about doing something about income inequality. I would venture say there's not much he can do, but states can definitely do something by raising the minimum wage. There's a number of states where this is now a topic. Talk a little bit about that, Rich.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly can, and many states do have minimum wages which are above $7.25. But I mean, any effect that has can either be counterintuitive or can just be de minimis. Basically, if you're raising the minimum wage, there are a lot of people that are, for example, could be in a family making over $50,000. A lot of them could be between 16 and 24 years old, just trying to get a little extra money for, you know, not necessarily people who absolutely need the money. Now, for the people who do, though, I do think that the best way to kind of ameliorate this problem, because there are people who are of the 2.8% of the population that legitimately is making the makes the minimum wage. I think that there are people who legitimately do need some sort of a tax break or some sort of a way to get out of poverty. And I think the best way is to expand the earned income tax credit. It was actually an idea going back to Jack Kemp, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton. It's a way to basically put more money. It's a tax refund. It puts more money in people who are working in their pocket without necessarily disparaging from an employer who could decide that they're just going to use automation instead of, you know, hiring somebody new, or, you know, who theoretically could pass the prices on to the consumers in, you know, in poor neighborhoods as well.
You guys, let's move on to Convince Me. And the question, Tom, that you had been asking is, or Convince Me, what can be done? I'm going to give you guys 45 seconds. So just one thing. Of course, this is such a large issue, and there are several solutions, as there is in everything. But if there's one thing that you would change to help income inequality, what would it be? Tom, you go first.
45 seconds. We need the equivalent of a GI Bill for returning veterans and people who have an equivalency degree or a two-year education to go get degrees and get qualified in STEM jobs, high-paying science and technology jobs. We don't want to subsidize philosophy degrees or art history degrees. Mom and dad can pay for those, but this economy needs people to go back to work at jobs that pay a higher wage. And the papers are full of unfilled jobs in those sectors because you can't find the people qualified to fill them. Let's qualify those people. Let's do it at government expense. It's a great investment. It'll pay you back. A whole generation drove a boom in the 1950s in the GI Bill. We can do the same thing again today.
Right on the button. Ed Rombach.
All right. The key word here, the watchword, is growth. Not austerity, growth. Because there are no problems that this country has. No social ills, no other problems that we have that can't be addressed with enough robust economic growth. All right. And my approach to that would be, or at least one of my approaches to that would be to radically overhaul and reform the tax code. That's one of the things that they're talking about. You hear more and more about that in Congress. My own recipe would be to go for a 10% flat tax on all sources of income. Earned income, interest income, dividends, capital gains, corporate income tax, Social Security, payroll tax.
Okay, got it.
5% paid by employer, 5% by employee.
Got it. Rich, go ahead.
Yes, well, I think my earlier idea, I think of expanding the earned income tax credit, because that will put money directly in the pockets of people who are working. But I also think that another thing that you could potentially do would be certainly at the state level would be certainly job training, as Ed or as Tom was recently saying about, you know, just putting more money into the just basically job training programs within the state.
Okay, I got to tell you, hands down, Tom Farmer, you got this one. I think education is definitely the route for this, and as you mentioned, there's pages and pages of jobs out there in the newspapers, and STEM. You know, everyone else in the world is kicking our butt in math and science. Okay, let's.
And I would also, You can add into that also vouchers as well, so that the young people get the same education, particularly in underprivileged neighborhoods, as their counterparts in the more affluent neighborhoods
Okay, Rich,
as well.
you got a +1 for that one. You got a smiley face for that one. Let's move on. Incredible. Okay, so the Senate comes up with a deal, the bipartisan deal sent to the president 5 days earlier. The House, I think it was like 73% of House Republicans voted for it. In the Senate, 5 days later, 73% of senators voted against it. Tom, what happened?
Well, you got a bunch of senators on the Republican side of the aisle who are up for re-election next year and don't want to be seen caving to the responsible moderate path. In the House, the Republicans who voted against the budget were laid pretty low after the about 3-1 margin vote last week. In the Senate, you got a bunch of high-profile guys: Mitch McConnell, John Cornyn, several more who voted no on this thing because they're all getting primaried, which is now maybe the verb of the year. You're getting primaried by somebody who's more extreme than you are, and the snark factor is now moved under the rotunda and over to the Senate side of the Capitol. Hard to believe, but there you are. In the end, what we've demonstrated here is that you win in the middle. Something Bill Clinton figured out 20 years ago. Run to the middle, do a compromise. You're going to govern. You're going to move ahead, and the people left in the sidelines are going to look ridiculous. And that's where we are today.
I want to ask you guys about Paul Ryan. Do you sense a major shift in his game plan? A lot of the things in the budget were things that he were adamantly against in the Ryan budget plan about a year ago. Rich, do you sense a game plan change?
Well, politically, I've always maintained, I think that his ambitions are more in the House leadership, whether it's to become chairman of the other committee, which he's a member of, the Ways and Means Committee, or potentially to become a future Speaker of the House. Seems a lot more institutional, a lot more interested in kind of the policy issues than he is necessarily in campaigning for president. I think had he been looking toward a potential presidential run in 2016, this would not have been advantageous to him, particularly with the Tea Party influence in the Republican Party. And so my guess is that he's looking more of an institutional role within the House. And remember this, by the way, when he was running for vice president last time, he also ran for re-election for a seat in Wisconsin. Now, if he was thinking down the road, I'm going to run for president in 2016, the last thing he would do would also be to run for re-election, because, well, first of all, if he loses, he's out of politics for good. But also, if he wins, then he has to. If he wins, then he becomes a part of kind of the unpopular Republican Party in the House of Representatives, and he could also, by the way, he could have spent the next 2 years essentially running around the country, barnstorming, campaigning for other Republicans running for Congress in 2014, and then collect a lot of chits for 2016, similar to what Nixon did in '66. But it's very, I think, odd to me that he did run for re-election. So I'm thinking that maybe his real ambitions is to become either majority leader or become Speaker of the House, but to stay within the institution.
Interesting. Ed, they reached a budget deal, but they haven't addressed the debt issue. So there's not going to be a government shutdown for a few months, but this could be an upcoming problem as well.
Right. Well, I mean, right from the beginning, I felt that this debt deal was totally insignificant, meaningless almost. All this fuss over $23.5 billion in deficit reduction over 10 years. If it weren't for the outrage of cuts in veterans benefits and the termination of extended unemployment benefits for the long-term unemployed, the deal would be laughable, because just last week, the U.S. Treasury reported that the federal budget deficit continues to shrink rapidly. It dropped $135 billion in November. That compares to $172 billion in November of last year. That's a $37 billion improvement in 1 year without any intervention. That's just the economy throwing off enough new tax revenue, plus the sequester, plus the tax increases on the upper incomes. So they should really not be trying to intervene and meddle. This will take care of itself. At this rate of deficit reduction, the budget will be in balance within 2 years. Not that that's a panacea either, because then you start to get into a situation where there's not enough stimulus.
Oh, okay. Let's move on. Unless you guys have any final words on the budget, let's wrap it up. We're a week away from Christmas. A lot of people taking holidays at this time, so I want to start out by wishing everyone happy holiday. And Pat, last 45 seconds of final thoughts. Let's start out around the horn. Start with Ed Rombach. You got 45 seconds.
All right, according to a new Gallup poll, 72% of Americans say that big government is a greater threat to the U.S. in the future than either big business or big labor. So, however, that 72% doesn't just represent Republicans who are only too happy to express their disgust with the Obama administration, because it includes Democrats, 56% of whom are now worried that big government is the problem. And that compares with 32% when Obama first came to office. So the big question is, why are Democrats souring on big government? Well, I think Senator Coburn from Republican from Oklahoma may have some answers in that. They just published, his staff just published an annual waste book. Yes, and it's identified $30 billion of wasteful spending by the government.
We'll
and
take a look.
Just one I'd like to point out. Bear with me. This one is by the National Institute of Health.
Go ahead.
And, honey, are you listening? It says it costs a small amount, $325,000, and it finds that wives would find marriage more satisfying if they could calm down faster during arguments with their husbands.
All right,
Ed,
Ed.
are you listening?
Ed, you're cut off. Rich.
Yes. On another more interesting, on another note, last week I was talking about the possibility of Peter Shumlin, the governor of Vermont, potentially getting into 2016 and running to the left of Hillary Clinton and/or Joe Biden. Another possible prospect is Brian Schweitzer, the former governor of Montana, very populist, has a little bit of kind of Huey Long, and he's kind of an amalgamation between Huey Long and Hubert Humphrey. Very kind of very rural Democrat. Certainly the Democrats have a lot of problems in rural states, in red states. He had a 60% job approval rating for most of his second term as governor of Montana. Probably would have been reelected again. As a matter of fact, a Democrat was reelected to succeed him. He's talking about potentially running for president, visiting all 99 counties of Iowa, and he has called Barack Obama. He's already going after Barack Obama, calling him a corporatist, and he's essentially advocating a single-payer health care plan. But what's interesting is he also has kind of a libertarian proclivity as well, because, for example, on some of the more rural issues, for example, he supported the Keystone Pipeline, and he also is he's also an opponent of many gun control measures. He says, you control your gun, I'll control mine. So he has the potential of really attracting a broad cross-section of constituencies, and my prediction is that he will be a player in the Democratic primary.
Very interesting, and I'm sure he's not the last name that we'll hear about. Tom?
What do most Americans want for Christmas? What do they want underneath the tree? They want Washington to go away. They don't want Santa president coming down the chimney or anybody like him. There is a new CBS New York Times poll released today which says that uninsured Americans, people without health insurance, are opposed to Obamacare in greater numbers than people who are insured. Now, these are the people this legislation and this act are supposed to help. This is supposed to be their big break, and they hate it more than the people who are being jacked up and having their policies canceled and having higher rates imposed on them. They don't like being told what to do by the government. They object to the price of the deal. They don't think the freedom of choice issue is playing in their favor. So it's going to be a very, very difficult year in 2014 for the administration to sell this thing in. It is not sold now. The website was the least of it. Just wait until all this stuff starts coming home to roost next year.
Oh, great. Okay. Rich Rubino, Ed Rombach, and Tom Farmer, thank you so much. Happy holidays, you guys.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Merry
holidays,
Christmas,
guys. More eggnog, please.
Sim Sullivan.
See you guys next week. Thank you.
Yeah.